When a teen vanishes from her small West Virginia hometown, no trace of her is found until her remains are discovered in a backwoods stream months later. A present-day lead results in the reopening of a heartbreaking cold case in this episode of Last Seen Alive. Thanks for listening to Last Seen Alive. I'm your host, Leah, crime analyst by day and true crime storyteller by night.
And as always, I'm your co-host, Scott.
A quick heads up. This episode contains brief mention of the subject of sexual assault. We won't go into any graphic detail, but still, please listen with care. Theresa Woods was last seen alive on February 20th, 1986. She was 14 years old at the time and lived in Oak Hill, West Virginia. Oak Hill is a small town in Fayette County, home to about 8,000 people and located just outside of New River Gorge National Park. The area is known for its breathtaking mountains, river views, waterfalls, and abundant recreational opportunities, especially those that revolve around water. It's the kind of place tourists flock to for the weekend to hike or to whitewater raft, but for Theresa, it was home. That hadn't always been the case, though. In fact, by February of 1986, Theresa had just moved to Oak Hill. She'd only been living there for about 3 months, but she hadn't come from far away. She'd previously lived in the nearby community of Kimberly, which is a census-designated area also located in Fayette County.
Yeah, it can be really hard and challenging moving when you're about 14.
Yeah.
Speaking from personal experience there.
Yeah, same.
But at least she's not moving across the country, and it's still within the same county she was already in.
Right. It wasn't a long-distance move, but she did have to go to a different school, which of course is a big deal. Now, Theresa's parents were divorced, and her mom had recently remarried, which was the cause for their move. Her mom, Betty, and stepdad, Rick, both worked for an Oak Hill company called B&B Ambulance, which provided patient transport. They made the move to Oak Hill so they wouldn't have to drive from another part of the county every day for work. Fortunately for Theresa, whose naturally shy and quiet nature usually made making friends pretty difficult, the move essentially came with a built-in friend. The home Theresa, her mom, and stepdad moved into in Oak Hill was a trailer owned by their boss, right beside her own home, and their boss had a daughter just a couple years older than Theresa, a girl named Angel. Theresa and Angel hit it off right away. Although they'd just met, it was as if they'd known each other for much longer. According to what Angel would later tell the Fayette Tribune, Theresa spent so much time at her house that she really only went next door to her own home when it was time to shower or sleep.
Yeah, I mean, it's really sweet that she and Angel have that close of a bond, especially if she is shy and withdrawn. It really sounds like they were closer to being sisters than just friends.
Sure, and the friendship did make the move easier on Theresa, but parts of it were still tough. Like I said, she had to start over at a new school in the middle of the school year, and for an introvert like Theresa, that of course wasn't much fun. Although she maintained straight-A grades, she missed her old school, and keep in mind that Angel was a couple years older, so Angel was already in high school, whereas Theresa was still a middle school student, so they did not see each other during the school day. Theresa also spent time with her dad, Hank, who owned and ran a grocery store in Kimberly. The two were close, and she spent nearly every weekend at his house. That was normal. What wasn't normal was when, in early February, Theresa came to his house for the weekend and was visibly upset. Although she was upset enough to cry, when her dad asked what was wrong, she wouldn't tell him. Instead, she asked him whether she could come live with him instead of in Oak Hill with her mom and stepdad, and he told her that that was a decision that her mom would also have to be involved in.
Yeah, that's a heartbreaking place to be in when your kid's that upset and yet you really can't do anything in that moment to change the situation. Your hands are tied, and I mean,
right.
An incredibly difficult situation from both the daughter's perspective and the father's perspective.
Yeah, and the mom's, I'm sure. With joint custody, it's definitely a two-parent decision. Now, speaking of which, around that time, Theresa also asked her mom whether she could return to her old school. In response, her mom told her to finish out the school year at her new school and then they could reevaluate.
Like I said, it's a very difficult situation, but it does sound like the parents were kind of on the same page. They weren't really holding grudges or putting Theresa in the middle of this dispute, and that she wasn't completely opposed to doing this in the future.
Right, I don't think it was one of those cases. It seems to me like they both loved their daughter. Now, during the last weekend Theresa spent with her dad, the last time he'd ever get to see her, although he didn't know it at the time, she was still upset and crying and still refused to reveal why. When asked, she told him that if she told him, she'd be in trouble at her other home in Oak Hill.
Yeah, given the circumstances and the fact that we're covering this case, those words sound like they are hauntingly foreboding.
Right, in retrospect, it's pretty troubling. Now, according to what her dad would later tell WWVA News, Theresa had not wanted to go back to Oak Hill, but she'd had to. Soon thereafter, on February 20th, a Thursday, Theresa went missing. The day of her disappearance started out ordinarily enough, as far as anyone knows. She got up for school, donned a stylish outfit, she loved fashion, and went to school. She walked there, as was her habit, even in winter. She did not like riding the school bus. That afternoon, her parents expected her to walk from school to the office where they worked, on Main Street, since that was what she always did. Normally, she would walk, would meet her friend Angel along the way, and the girls would arrive at the office together. Being a couple years older than Theresa, as I mentioned, Angel was already in high school. Theresa, on the other hand, was still a middle school student, so normally Angel would ride the school bus to a location across the street from the middle school and would get off there so that she could walk with Theresa from the middle school to their parents' office.
That just goes to show Angel's character, I think, and how much she really cared about Theresa, because I know when I was in school, there was this stigma about hanging out with kids that were in a lower school than you and how it would be uncool to be their friends, but to purposely get out and go that extra step to care about them. It speaks a lot to who Angel is.
Yeah, it sounds like Angel was a really thoughtful friend, and in fact, later in life, she would go on to have a daughter who she actually named after Theresa, so I think it's obvious that she genuinely cared for her quite a lot. Now, with that being said, on that particular day, through no fault of her own, Angel was not able to keep their routine. That's because her little brother was out sick that day, and their mom had contacted the high school to have an employee relay a message to Angel. She wanted her to bring her brother's books home from school for him so that he wouldn't get too behind on schoolwork while he was out. And apparently, he had a lot of books. Too many for Angel to carry during a long walk on top of her own. So, Angel formulated a new plan. She'd ride the school bus to the office that afternoon, drop off the books, and then walk back to the middle school so that she could meet Theresa. She was a good friend, and she didn't want Theresa to think she ditched her. And of course, this all happened in 1986, so it wasn't as if she could just text Theresa to tell her something had come up. If she didn't show, Theresa might think that she ditched her.
Yeah, completely normal thought process there. And again, it just shows how caring Angel really is for Theresa.
Sure. To Angel's surprise, when she reached the middle school, though, there was no sign of Theresa. Angel walked back to the office, but Theresa wasn't there either. When 5 p.m. arrived and Theresa hadn't shown up at the office, no one knew where she was, and they were worried. It wasn't in Theresa's character for her to just go off without telling anyone, nor was it in her character to venture off anywhere on her own, really. Her dad would later describe her to the Charleston Gazette as a scaredy cat. And let me tell you what he meant by that. Here's an example. Back in Kimberly, her dad and her grandmother lived next door to each other. Their houses were so close together that they were encircled by a single shared fence, so they shared this enclosed yard. Even so, every time Theresa had gone between the two houses, which of course she'd done all the time, she had insisted on the porch lights being on. She refused to walk so much as a few yards in the dark. So, Theresa's mom, Betty, called the local police to report her daughter missing. At first, police didn't seem to take the report very seriously, and Scott, given that it was 1986, that probably does not surprise you.
No, it really doesn't, and I'm just waiting to hear those words that I hate so much. However, whenever you're dealing with a juvenile going missing, you can't delay this. And definitely it's inappropriate to say that you have to wait 24 hours.
Right. Now, I don't know if they told her parents specifically that they needed to wait 24 hours, but I do know that they told her, hey, she's a teenager. She probably just ran away.
Yeah, that's just as sickening. I mean, we talked about that in the Joni Hall case. Like you said in that episode, generally, if it is a runaway, the family has an idea that it is, or they'll tell law enforcement, hey, we think this is a runaway. There's not like this out of the blue, this kid ran away and nobody knows why.
Right. When a teenager runs away from home without permission, the family usually knows that's what happened and will tell you. Now, in any case, Theresa's parents had no intentions of leaving Finding Theresa to police. Around the time Betty reported Theresa missing, her husband, Rick, who had been out on a work-related errand, returned to the office. The two of them set off in their vehicle to search for Theresa. Betty would later tell the Fayette Tribune, quote, "We drove every route she possibly could have walked between the school and the B&B office. We went down Virginia Street, we went pretty much in circles, and even the route she would have taken to go from the school home in case she had been upset about something, but we couldn't find her and we looked until after dark." End quote. Of course, Betty hadn't just called police. She'd also called Theresa's dad, Hank. And as soon as she'd told Hank that Theresa was missing, Hank had closed his store and hurried to Oak Hill. Once there, he too searched for Theresa, tracing and retracing walkable routes between her school and the office on foot, while her mom and stepdad searched via vehicle, so they kind of had every area covered. Reportedly, the police officers that he spoke to suggested to him that Theresa had probably run away, but he knew his daughter and he knew that wasn't the case. He would later tell journalist Susan Williams, quote, "I know she wasn't a runaway. I talked to one trooper for over 90 minutes on the phone trying to convince him that she did not run away. She was a scaredy cat." End quote. Theresa's parents canvassed the small town well into the night but found no sign of her, which, given Theresa's fear of the dark, was troubling. It would turn out that the last place anyone was known to have seen Theresa was in front of a local 7-Eleven gas station, which was located close to her school and where she had reportedly been seen leaning against a pole.
Okay, so that's just like another mirroring callback to the Joni Hall case.
Yes, there are a lot of similarities between these two cases. I'm sure it's giving some of our listeners deja vu since we covered Joni Hall just 2 weeks ago. Now, where Theresa went from there is anyone's guess. Her parents did not believe that she would get into a vehicle with anyone she didn't know. It also seemed difficult to believe that anyone could have forcibly abducted her, considering that she'd last been seen in broad daylight in a public location. In order to forcibly abduct her, someone would have had to have been very quick and would had to have gotten pretty lucky in terms of not being seen.
Yeah, and just to touch on her demeanor and how she's acting when she was last seen, if she was a runaway or if she was waiting for someone, I don't think she would have had the composure of just leaning up against that pole. I think she would have seemed more anxious, or that would have been something that people would have noticed about how she was acting at that 7-Eleven.
Right, she didn't appear to be distressed. It sounds like she was casually hanging out across from the school, probably waiting for her friend Angel to show up. Now, all of this suggests, of course, that Theresa, like most homicide victims, may have met with foul play at the hands of someone she knew. An acquaintance of some kind, or perhaps someone closer. Her dad, Hank, believed that this was the case, that she must have gotten into a vehicle with someone known to her. Theresa remained missing for days, weeks, and then months, during which her parents appeared on local TV news broadcasts, appealing to anyone who had seen their daughter or who knew where she might be to report what they knew to police. Her grandmother also appeared on TV, appealing to Theresa herself, telling her, just in case, that if she had run away, she was loved and wanted at home. Despite all of their pleas, Theresa remained missing and no helpful information came in. 3.5 agonizing months stretched by in this way until the questions regarding the mystery of Theresa's whereabouts were finally answered. However, the answers were not the ones anyone had hoped for. More on that next. And now, back to Theresa's story. By early June, the West Virginia winter into which 14-year-old Theresa Woods had inexplicably disappeared had given way to early summer. People were hiking out into the mountains again and frequenting their waters as seasonal recreation began to boom. 2 of those people were fishermen who had set out to capture bait minnows along Laurel Creek in Fayette County and who instead stumbled upon skeletal remains. They found the remains beneath a cliff face. Whether or not the remains had been thrown over the cliff or washed up there by the river, I'm not sure. None of the reporting I've been able to locate on this case specifies. I do know, however, that that part of Laurel Creek is located by a rarely traveled logging road, so it was pretty out of the way.
Okay, I think now is a good time to say what we say almost every fall, which is if you're one of the people that are going out into the woods or if you're an outdoorsman, pay attention to the ground around you. I mean, how many times do we cover a case where it's a hunter or a fisherman that's going out into these untraveled areas that happens to solve or bring at least a step closer to closure for one of these unsolved cases?
Yeah, we've covered a number of cases where hunters or fishermen are the one to stumble upon the remains of victims. And that's not just because they're out and about in the woods. It's because in the fall, vegetation dies back and things can be seen that would have been obscured by that vegetation during the warmer months. So if you're a hunter and you're heading out into the woods this time of year, definitely keep an eye on your surroundings.
I think this case really speaks to how much the families care and what finding some of these remains could mean to people.
Right, it's a big deal, obviously. Now, in this case, the remains, which had skeletonized, had clearly been out there for a while. Investigators had to carefully and repeatedly sift through the sand with a strainer in order to recover the smaller bones. As they did so, it was clear that the remains likely belonged to a young woman. Although her body's soft tissue had long since been eroded by time and natural decomposition processes, some of her auburn hair was still present. So was much of her stylish outfit, a lavender blouse, blue jeans, and one gray suede boot, and even jewelry. These clothing items were exactly what Theresa had been wearing on the day she disappeared. After the discovery of the remains, the medical examiner used a combination of clothing, jewelry, and the skull, presumably its teeth specifically, to identify the remains as being Theresa's. Not only was she deceased, he concluded, she had been murdered. Although Theresa's manner of death, homicide, was shared with the public, her cause of death, that is, exactly how she was killed, has never been shared. Whether that's because the medical examiner wasn't able to determine her cause of death, or whether that information was determined but is being held back for the sake of the investigation, I don't know. Reporting isn't clear on that aspect of the case. However, with all of her soft tissue being gone, I would not be surprised if they weren't able to determine the cause of death because, if she had been strangled, well, you're not going to be able to see that in circumstances like this.
No, I think that if it was determined, it would have to be from some sort of traumatic injury to the bone, such as a blunt force trauma or a gunshot wound that would have damaged the bones and been able to be verified.
Right.
So if there was a determined cause of death, I'd expect it to be something along those lines.
Yeah, something that would have damaged the bones and would have still been visible even if the remains had skeletonized. Now, if she was strangled, on the other hand, that might damage the hyoid bone, which is located in the throat and is very small, but being found in a river, that's probably not even present anymore to examine. Also, due to the advanced state of decomposition Theresa's remains were found in, I presume that the medical examiner was also unable to determine whether or not she had been sexually assaulted. I also assume that since her body and clothing had been exposed to the elements for months and were found either in or near the water, that there likely was no DNA evidence available to be collected from her body or clothing.
Yeah, whenever a 14-year-old girl goes missing, it's not a far jump for me to at least assume that was likely an intention of the kidnapping or murder.
Right. I immediately think, was this a sexually motivated crime? In this case, I have no way of knowing. In any case, the discovery of Theresa's remains devastated her family. When it came time to inter what was left of her body, her dad, Hank, placed her Cabbage Patch doll into her casket with her. He hadn't seen his daughter since the tearful last weekend she'd spent at his house, refusing to tell him what was bothering her, and now he would have to live the rest of his life without seeing her. After burying his daughter, he never changed his phone number, hoping that if someone wanted to contact him with information regarding her murder, they would call, and he never stopped speaking to the media about his daughter's unsolved case when the opportunity arose. He never stopped pressing investigators for answers either. In fact, for the first 2 years following Theresa's disappearance, he went to the police station multiple times per week to ask about her case. After the 2-year mark, he reduced his visits to a weekly frequency. He appealed to politicians, too, hoping for their assistance in securing justice, but none of them ever delivered on any of their promises.
Yeah, the emotional toll that this is taking on him, it reminds me of Joni Halligan and the emotional toll it took on her father.
Right, it reminded me of that case as well. Eventually, Hank made friends with another local man who'd lost his daughter to murder, a man named Edward. Edward's adult daughter, Kathy Carroll, was also murdered in 1986, just a couple months after Theresa's death. Hank and Edward understood each other in a way that people who've never lost a child to homicide simply cannot. Their friendship may have made their circumstances more bearable, but of course, when it comes to the murder of one's child, all comforts are, presumably, cold comforts. Ironically, when Theresa had first gone missing, Kathy, who had worked at Oak Hills City Hall, had promised Hank that she would help hang some of the posters featuring his daughter's disappearance around town. About 2 months after that, she herself was also killed. Despite occurring within just a couple months of each other in the same small community, Kathy and Theresa's murders do not appear to be related. They are, however, evidence that getting away with murder in Fayette County during the 1980s was perhaps not terribly difficult. We'll get into that more later. For now, know that over the years, Hank would also hang countless posters, like the ones Kathy had once helped him distribute, soliciting information about Theresa's murder, and would offer a cash reward for information leading to resolution in her case. He once told journalist Susan Williams, quote, "As long as I have feet in the mouth, I'll keep trying to find out what happened and who did this," end quote.
Yeah, I'm sure meeting Edward was almost like catching a second wind for him, because now it's not just you're the only one going through this. You have somebody that can identify with you.
Right, at least he had someone who understood. On the 25th anniversary of Theresa's disappearance and murder, he told journalist Susan Williams, quote, "I wonder what she might have done with her life. Would I have grandchildren? Not a day goes by that I don't think about her. I miss her," end quote. Despite all these efforts, he would go on to die in 2014 without ever receiving answers. He was just 62 years old at the time, and journalist Susan Williams believes that his death was one, at least partially, of grief. He would be buried in the cemetery plot beside Theresa's, where she had lain for decades with the Cabbage Patch doll he'd placed in her casket. Meanwhile, by this time, some of the investigators who had originally worked on Theresa's case had also died. Others had retired. The officers who had taken their places were, by and large, not familiar with Theresa's case. It had grown cold, and the grief it had inflicted on her dad, her most tenacious advocate, had led him to an early grave. When it comes to who murdered Theresa, it seems overwhelmingly likely that she, like most murder victims, was killed by someone she knew. At the time of her death, although she wouldn't reveal exactly why, she was clearly unhappy with life in Oak Hill and was trying to convince her parents to allow her to move away. Often, in cases of homicide, investigators look first to those closest to the victim. When it comes to Theresa, she didn't exactly have a boyfriend, but she did have a boy who she was interested in. His name was Alan, and he was a student at her new school. He was interested in her too, but at the time of Theresa's death, the two had yet to go on a first date. According to reporting for the Fayette Tribune, Theresa and Alan had come up with a plan for a first date. They wanted to go see a movie, and Alan's parents would accompany them. Theresa likely thought, or at least hoped, that her mom would agree to this chaperoned date, but she didn't. When Betty told Theresa that she didn't think she was old enough to date, chaperoned or not, this upset Theresa and caused a pretty big fight. Theresa's best friend, Angel, would later recall that conflict, telling journalist Susan Williams, quote, "The night her mom told her she couldn't go, there was a huge fight and argument. Not anything physical, but an argument over whether or not she was old enough to date," end quote. As for whether or not Allen was ever considered a person of interest in this case, I don't know. There's limited public information available. But keep in mind that he was a middle school student at the time, so younger than someone who would typically be involved in violence like this.
Yeah, it's hard for me to think that somebody that's asking for a chaperone date would really be likely to commit this level of heinous violence.
Right, and we're probably talking about a 13 or 14-year-old here. It doesn't seem like a likely scenario to me.
Yeah, and beyond even that, I mean, the logistics of murdering someone and then moving their body multiple miles.
As a child, too young to drive, yeah.
I don't imagine that they'd spend much time looking at him.
Now, moving on, as we've discussed in some past episodes, when young children are killed, it's usually at the hands of a parent or other caregiver. And it's easy to see how this makes sense, considering that most young children spend the majority of their time with their parents or other regular caregivers. However, when children reach their teenage years and begin to interact more with people outside of their family, the numbers shift. Teenagers, like Theresa, are more likely to be murdered by someone outside of their family, such as a stranger or, much more commonly, an acquaintance. Going by statistical likelihood alone, it was most likely an acquaintance of hers who took her life, perhaps someone she knew from school or from elsewhere around their small town. With that being said, even teens sometimes fall victim to violence at the hands of their parents or guardians. In this case, however, Theresa's dad and mom's whereabouts were both accounted for at the time of her disappearance. Her dad, Hank, had been operating the grocery store he owned in another town, and her mom, Betty, had also been at work at the ambulance office where she worked in Oak Hill. Theresa's stepdad, Rick, was the only parental figure whose exact whereabouts were perhaps unaccounted for.
Yeah, and I'm sure this will shock nobody. The step-parent in this case is the person that I'm most interested in looking into, especially since he doesn't have a way to verify or anyone to corroborate his alibi.
Yeah, that we know of. As far as public knowledge goes, sure. According to reporting for the Fayette Tribune, at the time of Theresa's disappearance, Rick was out, quote, on a run, end quote, from the ambulance office. Whether that run involved the transport of a patient or something else, I don't know for certain, as none of the reporting specifies. But the point is, he was reportedly out and about in one of the company's vehicles when Theresa went missing. Of course, this is not inherently suspicious, since being out and about in company vehicles was his job. But in a case like this, it's certainly something to take note of. Here's a quote about his absence at the time, published in the Fayette Tribune. This is Theresa's best friend, Angel, speaking. Quote, "We didn't go looking for her as soon as she didn't show up at the office because Rick was out on a run and we were waiting on him to get back, but his paperwork wasn't completed. There was no time and there was no mileage from the ambulance. None of that was done," end quote. And she goes on to note that this was unusual and that Rick was usually meticulous about the completion of paperwork.
It's an incredibly suspicious time for you to have one of these anomalous incidents pop up.
Sure, something to take note of, absolutely.
If he did happen to see her at the 7-Eleven, it would be very easy for him to be like, "Hey, do you want to ride back? I can give you a ride." Like, he's already in the ambulance. It's somebody that she knows. It meets all of the criteria of someone being easily able to get her into a vehicle without gaining suspicion.
Right, obviously he was someone she knew. Now, as for whether or not investigators considered Rick a person of interest in relation to Theresa's disappearance, I simply don't know. Again, this is one of those cases that perhaps has not received the kind of media attention it deserved. While researching this case, I was unable to find any reporting about it whatsoever in newspaper archives from the 80s and 90s, which is very unusual. As best I can tell, the local papers that would have covered the case at the time have not been digitally archived, at least not in a location that I have access to, which is a problem I rarely encounter. TV news broadcasts, which we know happened at the time, aren't available to me either and have perhaps been lost to time. And the case never received any national or even regional media attention. The reporting referenced in this episode is all local to West Virginia coal country and is all from the 2000s or later. Back in the 80s, though, it doesn't sound as if it was too terribly difficult to get away with murder in Fayette County. Earlier, I mentioned the murder of another Oak Hill victim, Kathy Carroll, whose bereaved dad found support in his friendship with Theresa's dad, Hank. Kathy was also murdered in 1986 and was well known around town to have been trying to extricate herself from an extremely abusive marriage. Her husband, Gene Carroll, was well known throughout the community of Oak Grove as a bully with a volatile temper. He spoke openly about wanting to kill Kathy and even offered a couple of local men several $1,000s if they would do it for him.
That's the kind of thing you hear about people ending up in jail for.
Right, soliciting murder is, of course, a crime in and of itself. Now, that's a lunar red flag, as you would say, Scott. And here's another one. Kathy was brutally murdered 15 hours before her scheduled divorce hearing.
It's hard to paint it any brighter red. Like, even the recording screen I'm looking at right now isn't enough red for me to justify how he's not in jail for this.
Right. Ultra red lunar flag. Now, not only was Kathy killed, but her teenage daughter was also attacked and sexually assaulted by her mom's murderer. Despite the heinous nature of these crimes, no one has ever been held responsible. Investigators say that Gene hired another local man, a sleazy boxing match promoter named Eddie Queen, who considered himself a ladies' man and who was reportedly obsessed with Kathy, who was exceptionally beautiful, to commit Kathy's murder on his behalf. There were multiple witnesses who'd seen Eddie in Kathy's neighborhood on the day of the murder looking extremely unkempt, and some local police officers saw Gene and Eddie together hours later that night. Now, quick note here, Eddie, the alleged contract killer, is not to be confused with Kathy's dad, Edward. Eddie and Edward are two very different men. Despite all this, and many more details I'm excluding here for the sake of brevity, the officers who originally worked the investigation never filed any charges or made any arrests in relation to the case, even though Kathy's daughter, who had been brutalized and forced to listen to her mom's murder, begged them to when they tactlessly interrogated her.
Okay, so already a lot of inappropriate aspects to this case going on,
Yeah, it wasn't the best investigation. It was very small-town 80s.
As we know, whenever you're dealing with a victim of sexual assault, you have to be extremely attentive to their needs and how you handle that.
Especially when they're a child. You know, in modern times, you would certainly not, at any reputable police department, have a regular officer just interrogating someone about this. That would be very inappropriate. But these were unfortunately different times. Speaking of different times, approximately 20 years would pass before a new sheriff took office, took interest in the case, and finally charged Gene and Eddie for their alleged involvement. And when they were eventually charged in the 2000s, things fell apart in court. More than 40 years after the murder, justice remains unserved. No one has ever been convicted of any crime in relation to Kathy's murder or her daughter's assault. So, justice, it seems, may have been hard to come by in 1980s Fayette County, to say the least. So perhaps it's no surprise that justice also remains unserved in Theresa's case. Not only has no one ever been convicted of her murder, no one has ever been charged or even publicly identified as a suspect. Much less is publicly known about her case than about Kathy's. However, like Kathy's case, Theresa's has received renewed interest from a newer generation of law enforcement. In 2021, the West Virginia State Police announced that they were reopening and investigating Theresa's case following the receipt of a new lead. West Virginia State Police Corporal Jay Kincaid told the Fayette Tribune that they received the lead in early 2020, but he has not disclosed the nature of the lead for the sake of the investigation. The investigation is finally active again, though, and any information related to Theresa's murder could prove to be of tremendous importance to modern investigators. If you know anything about the murder of Theresa Woods, please contact the West Virginia Crime Stoppers at 304-255-7867. You can remain anonymous if you'd like. Or, if you'd prefer, share what you know directly with the West Virginia State Police via their website, the link is in the show notes, or call their main information number at 304-746-2100. And if you found this episode to be of special interest, you may want to check out our episode on another unsolved West Virginia case, the disappearance of Gretchen Fleming. Her case isn't related to Theresa's, it's much more modern, but both cases tell the stories of young women who fell victim to foul play in the Mountain State and who have yet to receive justice. We aired our episode on Gretchen's disappearance in January of 2024. You can scroll back to then in our feed to listen if you'd like.
That's all for this episode of Last Seen Live. Thanks for listening. Make sure to check out our website, lastseenlivepodcast.com, for photos from the story and links to sources we used to write it. While you're at it, follow us on Insta at LSA Podcast and TikTok at Last Seen Live Podcast. Episodes of Last Seen Live air every Monday. See you then. If you think bringing unsolved cases like Theresa's to the public's attention is important, please take a moment to rate or review Last Seen Live and tell your friends to check us out too. We really do appreciate it. Also, don't forget to check out our merch store where you can get an LSA t-shirt or hoodie. Leah's been working very hard to bring some new designs and get that up and running again. We really appreciate her effort in that. As always, we donate 50% of the proceeds from every sale to the DNA Doe Project. Also, if you prefer to get your podcast from YouTube, we're currently working on getting our catalog posted there so you can listen there too. You can find us on YouTube at Last Seen Live Podcast. Last Seen Live is a Studio 222 production. Research and writing for this episode is provided by you, Leah. Audio engineering, editing, and hot takes are provided by me, Scott.